The quiet of Maplecroft Manor was shattered one crisp autumn morning when a servant discovered Lady Constance Pembroke's body sprawled across the polished parquet floor of the drawing-room. The scene was almost deceptively serene. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in its light, and the faint scent of Earl Grey still lingered in the air. On the small tea table beside her, a cup sat half full, its porcelain edge chipped, a spoon lying at an improbable angle. At first glance it appeared nothing more than a tragic accident, an unfortunate slip, a misstep, a fall. Yet the expression frozen on Lady Constance's face told another story, one of shock, sudden and complete. As though she had witnessed something or someone unexpected, Inspector Harrow surveyed the room with the practised eye of a man accustomed to disorder, yet frustrated by the impossibly orderly. Nothing had been disturbed, the furniture sat as it always did, the curtains hung evenly, and there were no signs of forced entry. But it was the tea table that drew his attention, a small, ornate piece inlaid with delicate flowers. It seemed absurdly insignificant in the drama of death, yet it held a clue that resisted easy explanation. A scrap of paper rested beneath the saucer, almost invisible against the polished surface. On it, a single line had been scrawled in an unfamiliar hand, "The past cannot hide." No signature, no further instruction, just those 4 enigmatic words. The staff was perplexed, and their stories conflicted in the smallest of details. The housekeeper swore she had prepared Lady Constance's tea at precisely 3 o'clock, as was customary, yet the footman insisted he had seen the lady sipping from the cup only moments before the body was found. No one reported hearing any disturbance, any raised voice, or even the shuffle of hurried footsteps. There was no sign of struggle, no weapon, no note that could have foretold the tragedy. It was as if the very air had conspired to conceal what had occurred. Word of the event reached Miss Jane Marple the next morning. She was visiting a distant cousin in the neighbouring village when a telegram arrived, curt yet urgent, Pembroke Manor, immediate assistance requested, Inspector Harrow at a loss. Known for her unassuming yet extraordinary insight into human nature, Miss Marple accepted without hesitation, her mind already working through the subtle intricacies that ordinary eyes would dismiss. By the time she arrived, the drawing-room was cordoned off, a faint smell of lavender from the fresh flowers mingling with the lingering aroma of tea. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn first to the tea-table, not because she was interested in porcelain, but because it seemed, peculiarly, the one element of the scene that did not belong. She noted the position of the cup and saucer, the angle of the spoon, even the faint ring of dampness on the polished wood. Then she bent slightly, observing the scrap of paper. Its edges were jagged, almost as though torn hurriedly, and the ink, a deep shade of blue, had begun to smear slightly from the steam of the tea. "The past cannot hide," she murmured, turning it over in her hands. The words themselves seemed trivial at first, but she had learned that trivialities often concealed the loudest truths. Harrow, growing impatient, asked the question everyone had been asking. How could this have happened? There were no witnesses, no apparent motive, no sign that Lady Constance had anticipated danger. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She let her eyes wander around the room, noting the patterns of wear on the carpet, the subtle smudges on the window pane, the slight tilt of a portrait on the wall. Every detail mattered. Every subtle irregularity whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen. Her attention was finally drawn to the teacup again. The pattern, a delicate ivy motif, was chipped at the handle, but the more she studied it, the more she realized that the chip was not random. Someone had touched the cup in a particular way, leaving traces of fingerprints too faint for conventional detection, but not for someone attuned to the human hand's instinctive habits. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, an expression Harrow found both irritating and oddly reassuring. It was the kind of smile that suggested the chaos of human behavior, messy, intricate, and yet patterned, could, with the right perspective, be deciphered. She began to ask questions, but not the obvious ones. She spoke to the servants, not just about times and tasks, but about minor grievances, small conversations, passing encounters, those negligible events that often concealed the threads of motive. One by one, subtle discrepancies emerged, the gardener's unusual insistence that he had seen Lady Constance earlier than he claimed, the maid's nervous avoidance of the drawing-room. The footman's inexplicable memory lapse concerning a delivery from the nearby village. Each small detail seemed inconsequential, yet Miss Marple knew better. In the web of human nature, the smallest strand could hold the key to unravelling a complex tapestry. By late afternoon, the room seemed unchanged to any ordinary observer, yet Miss Marple felt as though she had traversed the hidden pathways of the household, sensing conflicts and secrets that had never been spoken aloud. She studied the tea-table one last time, the mysterious notes still lying beneath the saucer, and allowed a faint smile to curve her lips. In that unassuming piece of furniture and the scrap of paper it held, the heart of the mystery pulsed. What appeared random was never random at all. The true clue had always been hiding in plain sight, disguised as a triviality too mundane for most to notice. Outside, the autumn sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Maplecroft Manor. Inside, the quiet tension of the drawing-room hung thick, yet beneath it lay a subtle promise. The terrible secret of the tea-table was waiting to be revealed, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, was the only one who could draw it into the light. The seemingly unsolvable crime had at last found the patient observer it required. Miss Marple began her inspection with deliberate calm, letting the bustle of uniformed officers and anxious servants play out around her like background noise. Inspector Harrow moved from corner to corner, cataloguing what he considered vital evidence, footprints, fingerprints, the angle of the body, but he was moving too fast, chasing the obvious while the subtle signals of the household went unnoticed. Miss Marple, by contrast, allowed herself the leisure to notice what had gone unnoticed, the whispers beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect scene. Her gaze first settled on the mantelpiece, where family photographs in ornate frames stood like silent witnesses. One in particular caught her attention, a portrait of Lady Constance seated in the very drawing-room where she had died. A faint crease across the corner of the photograph, suggesting it had been hastily handled or adjusted. More telling, the glass covering the frame bore a smudge that did not correspond with the usual dust or fingerprints of daily handling. It was subtle, easily overlooked, yet it hinted at a hand that had lingered, perhaps deliberately, in a moment of anxious secrecy. Moving closer to the tea-table, Miss Marple examined the teacup and saucer with renewed scrutiny. She noted the faint residue along the rim, not tea but something heavier, an oily texture that reflected light differently. It was as if the cup had been used not for drinking, but for some other purpose, and the effect would have been invisible to the untrained eye. She allowed her fingers to hover over the spoon, noting the microscopic angle at which it had been set down, not a casual placement, but the kind of adjustment made by someone conscious of appearances, someone wishing to create the illusion of normalcy. As she continued her careful sweep, a sudden movement caught her attention. The maid, a young woman with a habit of wringing her hands, had frozen in place by the doorway, her eyes darting to Miss Marple before quickly flitting away. Miss Marple's eyes followed the motion, recognizing it not as fear of the deceased lady but the hesitation of someone concealing knowledge. She noted the subtle blanching of the maid's cheeks, the way her lips pressed together, and the minute shifting of weight from one foot to another. In that silent hesitation lay the first flicker of deception, a human truth the official investigation had not yet glimpsed. Then her attention shifted to an object almost laughably mundane, a small brass letter opener lying near the edge of a sideboard. It had been brushed aside, deemed irrelevant by the authorities because it bore no obvious blood or signs of struggle. Yet Miss Marple observed its placement and the faint indentation in the polished wood beneath it. Someone had moved it recently, she realized, almost as if to cover an absence, to hide a void that mattered far more than the object itself. In her mind, a quiet thread began to form, connecting the paper with its cryptic message, the subtle residue on the teacup, and this small displaced item. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that comes when the puzzle starts to form shape. Here, in the ordinary, overlooked corners of the room, were the outlines of an extraordinary secret. She noticed how the sunlight caught the edges of the window pane, revealing a faint streak across the glass. It was invisible from the hall but clear from her angle, as though someone had leaned against it, leaving the faintest trace. A visitor, perhaps, or a servant concealing the truth. Miss Marple filed the observation away with careful precision, recognizing it as a piece of the larger, yet still incomplete tapestry. The inspector, busy directing officers to dust for prints and canvass the grounds, barely registered her movements. Miss Marple, in contrast, had already begun to reconstruct sequences in her mind. Who had entered and left the room? Who had touched the teacup? Why was the note there, cryptic and alone? Each question opened another possibility, yet the answers remained hidden, like fish slipping through a net. As the afternoon wore on, she engaged the household members in casual conversation, asking questions that seemed almost banal, about the weather, the timing of meals, the routine of deliveries. But each answer revealed a subtle shift, a tiny imbalance in the carefully constructed facade of propriety. The gardener, for example, insisted Lady Constance had been in the rose garden an age earlier, yet his boots bore traces of mud from the far side of the driveway, suggesting he had not been where he claimed. The footman spoke of having carried a parcel from the village, but his story wavered when pressed about who had actually signed for it. Each discrepancy was like a thread tugged slightly from a tapestry, revealing a hidden pattern beneath. By the time dusk settled over Maplecroft Manor, the drawing-room seemed unchanged, yet Miss Marple felt the invisible currents moving within it. The tea-table, the letter-opener, the subtle residue, the smudged photograph, the hesitant maid, all were signals pointing toward a truth that had yet to surface. Harrow, exhausted by routine procedure, could see nothing but the apparent simplicity of the scene. Miss Marple, with her keen eye and patient understanding of human nature, sensed the first tremors of revelation. Something had been concealed intentionally, and it would not remain hidden for long. The terrible secret the tea-table held had begun to whisper its story, and she was listening. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak directly with the household, beginning with the most immediate witnesses. She invited the maid, Mary Fletcher, to sit with her near the drawing-room fireplace, where the warmth of the fire softened the room's austerity. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap, her eyes flicking nervously toward the tea-table as if it might leap to reveal the truth at any moment. "Tell me everything you saw, Mary," Miss Marple said gently, her voice unassuming yet precise, leaving no room for evasion. Mary's account was careful, overly polished in places, and riddled with tiny gaps. She claimed she had brought Lady Constance her tea at precisely 3 o'clock, and had left immediately afterward, hearing nothing unusual. Yet when Miss Marple asked about the delivery from the Ville age that afternoon, Mary hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor, fingers twisting in the folds of her apron. She admitted the footman had handed her the parcel, but could not recall who had signed for it. The hesitation was fleeting, but to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. It suggested knowledge that Mary wanted to obscure, no matter how instinctively she tried to appear helpful. The footman, Thomas Granger, was next. He appeared eager to cooperate, almost rehearsed in his statements, claiming he had seen Lady Constance in the drawing-room just moments before the incident, that she had seemed entirely at ease, sipping her tea in the usual fashion. Yet when pressed about the time he delivered the package, and whether anyone else had been in the room, his voice faltered. He contradicted himself regarding the garden gate's position and the sequence of the servants' movements. Miss Marple noted the small signs of discomfort, an unnecessary clearing of the throat, the tapping of a foot, that betrayed an awareness of scrutiny. His eagerness, she realized, might be an attempt to control the narrative before others could reveal inconvenient truths. The gardener, Mr. Ellis, presented a different sort of puzzle. He was brusque, almost defensive, claiming he had seen Lady Constance in the rose garden an hour earlier and had returned to prune the hedges. Yet Miss Marple observed that his boots bore traces of soil inconsistent with his account. Furthermore, he seemed unconsciously attentive to the placement of the tea-table, his gaze flicking there each time he mentioned Lady Constance. His story was consistent in tone but flawed in detail, the kind of slip that suggested a memory carefully reconstructed to conceal an inconvenient fact. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Penrose, offered more questions than answers. She spoke with measured propriety, yet in describing the day's routine, she repeatedly corrected herself, shifting times by a few minutes here and there, or mixing up who had done what. It was as though the truth lay somewhere beneath layers of habitual service and a desire to maintain appearances. Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders, the small quiver of the eyelid whenever Lady Constance's death was mentioned. Everyone in the house seemed to carry a secret, however minor, and each secret formed a part of the puzzle. The conversation turned to the scrap of paper on the tea-table. When asked if anyone recognized the handwriting, all shook their heads, though the footman's hesitation was barely perceptible, a split second that suggested recognition without acknowledgement. Miss Marple allowed a quiet pause to settle over the room, letting the unspoken tension reveal itself. Human nature, she knew, often betrayed the guilty through omission, through those silences where words ought to have been. Subtle contradictions continued to surface. Mary claimed she had not seen the gardener that afternoon, yet Mr. Ellis insisted he had passed the servants' corridor while pruning. The footman described the delivery as routine, yet both Mary and the housekeeper gave slightly different times and recipients. Each discrepancy, small on its own, layered upon the next, constructing a lattice of uncertainty through which the truth shimmered faintly, waiting to be discerned. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her hands folded, observing the dynamics of the room. The maid fidgeted, the footman's eagerness bristled against gentle questioning, and the gardener's rigid posture suggested conscious concealment. Each person's behaviour, even when words remained carefully chosen, revealed hidden motives, fear, loyalty, embarrassment, or perhaps something darker. In the silence between answers, Miss Marple sensed the undercurrent of human desire and deceptio, the tangled web of interactions that had led to Lady Constance's demise. As dusk deepened into a shadowed evening, the room seemed charged with unspoken truths. Miss Marple, eyes never leaving the faces before her, began to mentally map the discrepancies, linking the hesitant words to subtle gestures and misaligned timelines. Every omission, every overemphasis, every fleeting sign of discomfort was a signal. The voices of deception, as she now understood, were all around her. Each had its own story, each hiding a piece of the puzzle, and together they pointed toward the terrible secret that the tea-table had silently borne witness to. The investigation, she realized, was only just beginning. The full picture was not yet visible, but the edges were starting to align, forming outlines that promised clarity if one only looked closely enough. Miss Marple spent the early evening quietly reviewing the information she had gathered, her mind moving through the household like a chess player surveying the board. Each witness, each subtle contradiction, each fleeting hesitation was a piece of the intricate puzzle. The challenge was not merely to identify who had acted, but to understand why. Motive, she knew, was often concealed beneath layers of civility, and the Pembroke household, with its polished surfaces and rigid routines, offered many such layers. Greed presented itself first, faint yet unmistakable. Lady Constance's estate was considerable, her fortune divided among distant relatives and a few loyal servants. The footman, Thomas, though seemingly humble, had recently made remarks that hinted at dissatisfaction with his modest wages and limited prospects. Even Mary, the maid, had confided to a neighbour in the village about a small inheritance she hoped to claim some day. Miss Marple noted these signs with care, for financial desire could be subtle, manifesting as idleness, peculation that later became action when opportunity arose. Then there was jealousy, far less tangible but no less potent. Lady Constance had long prided herself on her beauty and charm, even in the later years of her life, and there were whispers among the staff that her attention had sometimes favoured one servant over another, creating quiet resentments. The gardener, Mr. Ellis, for example, often lingered near the drawing-room when he might have been pruning or tending the grounds. Was it devotion or something more personal, a sense of entitlement crossed with irritation at being overlooked? Miss Marple filed the thought away, knowing that envy often mingled with other motives, shaping actions in ways outsiders could scarcely imagine. Revenge, too, threaded through the household in faint, almost imperceptible lines. Mrs. Penrose, the housekeeper, had endured Lady Constance's exacting demands for decades. A single careless word from the lady could trigger a cascade of reproofs, and Miss Marple wondered if a long-held grudge could finally have found expression. The maid and footman, too, had been subject to Lady Constance's occasional sharpness, and while outward obedience remained impeccable, resentment could simmer unseen, erupting in a moment of opportunity. The scrap of paper on the tea-table, its cryptic warning, suggested more than accident. It hinted at premeditation, the careful placement of a message meant to provoke, confuse, or mislead, fear, subtle but pervasive, complicated matters further. Lady Constance had been known for her formidable personality, and some members of the household displayed behaviour that suggested anxiety or avoidance. Mary's fidgeting, the footman's eager over-cooperation, the gardener's overly precise recounting of events, all pointed to the presence of a hidden tension, a fear of discovery or reprisal. Miss Marple realised that in his house, even the smallest deviations from routine could carry enormous significance. Fear often shaped action more quietly and persistently than overt malice. Alibis offered their own tangled web. The footman's insistence that he had been delivering the village parcel coincided with the maid's account, but small inconsistencies remained. Time discrepancies, overlooked passages, movements that did not align. The gardener's claim of tending the far end of the garden conflicted subtly with traces of mud and impressions in the gravel. Each story was plausible, even convincing in isolation, yet none could fully withstand the scrutiny of careful observation. The contradictions were faint, yet sufficient to reveal hidden truths when viewed together. Miss Marple began to map the connections, drawing invisible lines through the household, a footman's ambition linked to a minor inheritance, a maid's envy tied to perceived favouritism, the housekeeper's resentment entwined with decades of service, the gardener's quiet frustration mingled with minor slights. Each motive alone was insufficient, but taken together they formed a lattice of pressures, each person pushed by overlapping forces. The tea table, so innocuous yet central, had been the point of intersection. An ordinary object turned witness to the collision of human desires and deceptions. By the time the firelight waned and shadows lengthened across the drawing-room, Miss Marple had begun to see the outlines of a pattern. There was no single simple explanation. The crime was embedded in a network of human emotion, a maze in which greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear intersected. To untangle it would require patience, acute observation, and an understanding of the subtle interplay between motive and opportunity. Each suspect had reason, each story had gaps, and each gesture hinted at hidden intent. The challenge now was to follow the faint threads through the maze, to trace the invisible currents beneath the polished surfaces, until the terrible secret of the tea table was no longer a whisper, but a fully revealed truth. The following morning, excitement rippled through Maplecroft Manor as Inspector Harrow announced a breakthrough. A glove, discovered in the hedge maze behind the garden, had been identified as belonging to Thomas, the footman. The staff buzzed with speculation, and Harrow, satisfied with the apparent simplicity of the solution, declared that the case was nearing its end. To any outside observer, it seemed that the culprit had been caught. The footman, motivated by ambition and financial desire, had seized a fleeting opportunity to eliminate Lady Constance and claim a portion of her fortune. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly sceptical. She had watched Thomas closely during questioning, noting not only his words but his mannerisms, the eager over-assertion, the rehearsed explanations, the subtle signs of discomfort. None of it pointed conclusively to violence. The glove, she suspected, could easily have been displaced or planted. Small details, often dismissed by those eager for resolution, tugged at the edges of her mind: the smudge on the teacup, the note beneath the saucer, the hesitation in Mary's eyes, the gardener's almost imperceptible glances toward the drawing-room. Something about this breakthrough felt too tidy, too convenient. Despite her reservations, she observed as the authorities seized Thomas for questioning, the footman protesting his innocence yet appearing genuinely startled by the attention. Mary's face, meanwhile, betrayed a fleeting relief, quickly masked with an expression of polite concern, while Mr. Ellis folded his arms, his gaze drifting toward the tea table, as if remembering a detail too subtle to articulate aloud. Miss Marple's instinct, honed over years of quiet observation, warned her that the real truth was still hidden behind carefully arranged appearances. She lingered near the drawing-room, studying the tea table once more. The note, "The past cannot hide," seemed almost to pulse under her gaze, as if mocking the hastiness of the supposed resolution. The teacup remained in place, the faint oily residue along its rim unnoticed by the others, and the tiny chip on the handle caught the light just so, revealing a fingerprint too faint for the routine procedures of the inspector. It was a subtle signature of someone who had been there, someone who had handled the objects with intent, yet not with violence. Miss Marple's mind began tracing the invisible paths of movement through the room, the sequence of touches and placements that could only have been executed by someone familiar with the household's minute rhythms. The afternoon passed with a tense energy. The servants whispered among themselves, some relieved by the apparent resolution, others uneasy at the possibility that the true danger had not yet been revealed. The inspector, buoyed by the apparent success, relaxed slightly, ordering the staff back to their usual duties. Miss Marple, however, observed closely as the household settled, noting the subtle shifts in posture and glances exchanged across the room. The gardener's hand brushed against the edge of the table, the maid's fingers lingered near the teacup, the housekeeper's eyes flickered toward the door as if anticipating an unspoken arrival. Each movement was a whisper of concealed intent, a clue to the unresolved reality beneath the surface calm. As the evening deepened, she quietly reviewed the timing and sequences of the afternoon. The supposed breakthrough did not account for the slight inconsistencies in alibis she had already noted, nor the faint traces that only someone within timid knowledge of the household could manipulate. She thought of the scrap of paper, the cryptic message that had gone unnoticed by Harrow but had already guided her intuition. It was a warning, she realized, and one that applied not to the footman, but to the real architect of the crime, the individual who had orchestrated events to appear simple while hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the windows, catching the final rays of the sun as they fell across the drawing-room. Shadows stretched long across the parquet floor, creating deceptive shapes that mirrored the deceptive narrative the authorities had accepted. The real criminal, she sensed, was still in the house, watching, waiting, confident that the misdirection would hold until the perfect moment. It was the calm before a storm, the deceptive lull of a predator confident in concealment. She allowed herself a quiet sigh, not of defeat but of measured anticipation. The footman's apparent guilt had been a convenient distraction, a false victory that brought the household a fleeting sense of closure. Yet Miss Marple knew that the threads she had been tracing, subtle and persistent, would soon reveal the true pattern. The terrible secret of the tea table, and the shadowy presence orchestrating events behind it, had not yet spoken in full, and when it did, the revelation would be unmistakable, unmasking the real hand that had set the tragic sequence in motion. Miss Marple returned to her room that evening, but her mind remained with the drawing-room, retracing the day's events in precise order. While the household slept under the quiet shroud of night, she considered the patterns she had seen, the subtle discrepancies and almost imperceptible gestures. Something, she realized, tied the present to the past, a thread overlooked by those who only considered motive in isolation. Memories, grudges, all debts, and long-forgotten slights had a way of resurfacing at just the wrong, or perfectly calculated moment. Her thoughts drifted to a case she had once quietly followed from afar, involving a small country estate and a family dispute over inheritance. It had seemed minor at the time, dismissed by authorities as a petty quarrel, yet certain details lingered in her memory. A servant dismissed under questionable circumstances, a family member rumoured to have vanished under mysterious conditions, and a cryptic note that spoke of hidden debts. She wondered if someone at Maplecroft Manor had carried a similar history, a concealed thread that had finally unravelled in Lady Constance's drawing-room. The following morning, she quietly requested the household accounts and records, ostensibly to assist the investigation but truly to trace histories. As she examined the documents, a curious pattern emerged. Lady Constance had, decades earlier, been involved in the administration of a relative's estate, the same distant branch of the family implicated in that older, seemingly minor dispute. The footman's family, it appeared, had once served that very household, and whispers in the village suggested a long-standing grievance over dismissed service and lost inheritance. Even the maid's family had connections, albeit tangential, to a family feud that had simmered quietly for years. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align, revealing that the events of the present were not isolated incidents but echoes of long-buried animosities. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the tea table, the silent witness to the tragedy. The note beneath the cup, cryptic as it was, now seemed to carry greater weight. "The past cannot hide," she murmured, reading the words again with a growing understanding. It was a warning, perhaps even a confession, left deliberately to hint at an old grievance bay. NG avenged. She considered the small details she had previously observed, the misplaced glove, the smudge on the teacup, the chip in the porcelain, and realized they were not random. They were deliberate signals, planted by someone who knew the household intimately and understood how each minor disruption would be interpreted. Her investigation of past records also revealed another curious link. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penrose, had been employed in the same household decades earlier, though under a different name. In her previous service, she had witnessed a minor theft and the subsequent scandal that had quietly been resolved without legal action. Those involved had moved on, yet old resentments had clearly lingered. Miss Marple began to see a pattern. Lady Constance's careful management of her household had inadvertently revived old tensions. Each servant, each family connection, each historical grievance formed a hidden lattice of relationships that could explain the seemingly inexplicable behaviour of the present day. It became increasingly clear that the footman's apparent guilt had been nothing more than a convenient red herring, a device employed by someone familiar with both the household and its history. Miss Marple considered the gardener, Ellis, who had been unusually attentive to the tea-table and the drawing-room. His family's past, tied to the same estate as Thomas, suggested a network of motives and long-held grievances that were now intersecting with the present. Even Mary, the maid, seemed to occupy a position that allowed subtle influence, her presence masking the movement of someone else who could operate unnoticed. Miss Marple leaned back, connecting the threads. The crime was not merely about ambition or a sudden opportunity, it was about memory, about old scores long deferred, about subtle, deliberate manipulation. Someone had exploited the predictable. Routines of Maplecroft Manor, the hierarchy of servants, and the habits of Lady Constance herself, crafting a scenario in which old resentments could find expression without drawing immediate suspicion. The past had not disappeared, it had only been waiting, patient and persistent, to assert itself in the present. By late afternoon, she had mapped the hidden connections fully, seeing the web of relationships in its intricate entirety. Each person in the household, intentionally or not, was connected to those historical events, and the crime had sprung from a nexus of past and present grievances. The tea-table, still bearing its cryptic note, was not merely the site of death, but the focal point where history, human emotion, and opportunity intersected. Miss Marple realized that to reveal the true culprit, she would need to trace these historical lines carefully, exposing the concealed relationships that had allowed a shadow from the past to orchestrate such a meticulously planned act. The solution was there, buried beneath layers of time and memory, waiting for the precise moment when it could be brought into the light. Miss Marple, having traced the threads of the past and pieced together the lattice of motives, decided that the next step required more than questions or observation. It required a test of character. She knew that a subtle prompt, an unusual tactic, could provoke a reaction that words alone could not. She gathered the household in the drawing-room once more, careful to present it as a casual conversation rather than an interrogation. Her calm demeanour and the firelight dancing across the parquet created an atmosphere of relaxed familiarity, yet beneath it, the tension of observation was deliberate and precise. She began by discussing Lady Constance's habits, speaking of her love for tea and her attentiveness to the smallest details in the household. She casually mentioned a particular vase, noting how its placement had subtly shifted from one side of the mantel to the other, as though handled by an inattentive hand. "It is curious," she said softly, "how the smallest gestures, so easily overlooked, can reveal far more than grand actions. One must always watch what is not meant to be seen." The words were innocuous, yet they carried a double weight, a gentle invitation for the guilty to reveal themselves without realizing it. The maid, Mary, fidgeted but said nothing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penrose, nodded politely, pretending interest in the placement of the vase. It was Mr. Ellis, the gardener, whose reaction betrayed him. His hand twitched slightly toward the mantel, and his eyes darted briefly to the tea-table, as though confirming an unspoken detail. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple noticed it immediately. The micro-expression, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the subtle tightening of the jaw, spoke of a thought interrupted, a secret acknowledged too quickly and then buried again. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple continued in the same tone, recounting a story from an old estate she had visited, describing a theft and how the true culprit had been betrayed by the smallest gesture, a trembling hand, a glance at the object in question, a fleeting hesitation. "It is remarkable," she mused, "how human nature cannot resist revealing itself, even when we wish to be invisible. The cleverest plans are undone by the tiniest cracks." She allowed the words to hang in the air, observing carefully as the household reacted. Mr. Ellis shifted in his chair, a flicker of discomfort passing over his face. He tried to mask it with a cough, yet the tension was unmistakable. His gaze lingered on the tea-table longer than decorum allowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried a slight edge of defensiveness. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I do not understand your implication," he said, yet even as he denied it, his hand unconsciously traced the edge of the mantel, close to the vase, a silent acknowledgement of the connection Miss Marple had just highlighted. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, approving smile. The reaction, subtle though it was, confirmed her suspicion. The gardener knew more than he admitted, and his composure had cracked under the gentle pressure of her psychological cue. She noted the exact instant of the movement, the sequence of his responses, and the inconsistencies in his verbal and physical expressions. It was a masterful, almost imperceptible reveal, the sort of evidence that left no physical trace yet spoke volumes about the mind behind the actions. She then turned her attention back to the tea-table, observing it with renewed interest. The combination of the note, the tea residue, the chip in the handle, and the subtle traces of fingerprints formed a map of deliberate actions, each placed to create a narrative that obscured reality. Mr. Ellis's reaction had provided the missing piece, a confirmation that someone intimately familiar with both the household and the past grievances had manipulated the scene to mislead investigators. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone casual yet sharp. "It is often the simplest things, the things that seem ordinary, that contain the greatest truths. One glance, one small movement, is enough to betray what words attempt to conceal." She allowed the room to absorb the remark, observing each face carefully. It was not a threat, but a mirror held up to human behavior, and in that reflection the truth began to shimmer faintly through the artifice. By late afternoon she had all she needed to focus the investigation, the unconventional tactic, a gentle psychological prod, a careful observation of micro-expressions and subtle gestures, had succeeded where routine questioning had failed. The small crack in Mr. Ellis's composure, unnoticed by the inspector and others, revealed a path that led directly toward the orchestrator of the crime. The terrible secret of the tea-table was no longer merely hidden. It had begun to surface, guided by the careful eye of someone who understood that human nature, even when masked, always left traces that could not be fully concealed. Miss Marple had spent the morning retracing every movement of the household, reconstructing the subtle patterns that had hinted at Mr. Ellis's hidden knowledge. Her mind was a careful map of gestures, glances, and minor inconsistencies, each pointing toward the orchestrator of Lady Constance's death. Yet even as she prepared to share her insights with Inspector Harrow, an unsettling discovery interrupted her quiet contemplation. The scrap of paper, the cryptic note beneath the teacup, the first clue that had drawn her attention, was gone. She approached the tea-table, half expecting to find it, yet the delicate porcelain remained untouched, the cup in its precise angle, but the note had vanished without a trace. Her heart sank slightly. Someone had removed it, deliberately and with intent. Whoever had done so clearly understood its significance. And now the key to understanding the crime's orchestration had been taken from her reach. Harrow, entering the room with an air of unwarranted triumph after the previous breakthrough, appeared equal. "I surprised." "What do you mean it's gone?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Miss Marple explained succinctly, noting the precise positioning of the teacup and the subtle residue she had observed the day before, evidence now made more urgent by the disappearance of the note. The inspector frowned, but seemed more concerned with maintaining the illusion of progress than considering the implication that the perpetrator remained active and aware of the investigation. The household, too, was stirred by the revelation. Mary, the maid, wrung her hands nervously, while Mrs. Penrose glanced sharply at Mr. Ellis, whose posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple's eyes followed each movement with careful attention. She noted that the gardener's fingers brushed the edge of the mantel in the same habitual gesture as yesterday, yet today there was a subtle hesitancy, a sign of awareness that went beyond mere presence. He knew something had shifted, and the disappearance of the note had unnerved him in a way that could not be faked. Miss Marple decided to retrace the steps she had observed the day before. She examined the floor closely, noting faint scuff marks near the corridor connecting the drawing room to the servants' quarters, a trail too light for conventional detection but clear to someone who looked closely. She realized that the note had not simply been removed, it had likely been carried away deliberately, perhaps to confuse the authorities or to buy time for the culprit to erase additional traces. The action was precise, controlled, and deliberate, suggesting a hand well practiced in deception. She called the household together under the guise of reviewing daily duties, subtly observing reactions as she described the note and its contents. As she spoke, she noticed that Mr. Ellis's gaze repeatedly flicked toward the study door, a nervous acknowledgement that betrayed his awareness of the significance of the evidence. Mary's hands trembled slightly more than usual, and the housekeeper's carefully measured expressions faltered in microseconds, tiny cracks that revealed a complex web of fear and complicity. Miss Marple's suspicions solidified. Someone among them had acted to interfere with the investigation, and the disruption was a warning as much as it was an obstruction. Harrow, eager to regain his sense of control, suggested a thorough search of the house. But Miss Marple shook her head. She knew the perpetrator would anticipate such measures, and would have already hidden or destroyed the note in a place obvious to no one but themselves. A conventional sweep would reveal nothing, and the result would be further false confidence. Instead, she chose to focus on behavior and subtle indicators, where the household members' attention lingered, how they responded to her observations, and the involuntary gestures that gave them away. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in Maplecroft Manor had shifted palpably. The vanished note had transformed the investigation from a quiet puzzle into a high-stakes contest. Trust, already fragile, now trembled on the edge of suspicion. Every smile, every carefully modulated word became a potential clue, and Miss Marple understood that the real culprit was deliberately observing, manipulating, and hiding in plain sight. The stakes had risen sharply. The game was no longer about understanding motive alone, but about anticipating the next move of someone cunning enough to act before discovery. She returned to the tea table one final time that day, letting her gaze linger over the cup, the residual markings, and the position of the furniture. The absence of the note was not defeat, it was a challenge. The secret it had carried, and the truth it had hinted at were still within reach, but only for the patient observer who could read the subtle signals left behind by a hand skilled in concealment. Miss Marple understood that the next steps required even greater care, a meticulous reading of human nature, a tracking of invisible currents, and the knowledge that the perpetrator, aware of every scrutiny, was now working to keep the terrible secret hidden until the precise moment they chose to act again. The following evening, a sharp, unsettling tension hung over Maplecroft Manor. The household moved with careful deliberation, each member acutely aware of the vanished note and the subtle scrutiny it had provoked. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her mind tracing the intricate web of motives and hidden resentments. She had a sense that the perpetrator was observing, testing the patience and skill of anyone who sought to uncover the truth, yet nothing could have prepared her for the sudden shock that would shatter the tenuous stability of the manor. It was just after dusk when the first scream echoed through the corridors, a high, piercing cry that carried the unmistakable terror of immediate danger. Miss Marple and Inspector Harrow rushed toward the sound, finding Mary the maid collapsed at the foot of the staircase, her hands trembling, her face pale. Beside her, a small table had been overturned, a tray of freshly prepared tea scattered across the floor, and the room beyond, the study where Miss Marple had suspected secret movements, was empty. The door, previously locked, now stood ajar, revealing that someone had slipped inside with alarming ease. The house seemed to breathe uneasily, shadows stretching unnaturally in the firelight. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the scene, noting instantly the subtle signs of intrusion, a scuff on the floor leading toward the library, the faint impression of a foot against the rug, and the almost imperceptible dragging marks on the floor where a small object or person had been moved. Someone had taken advantage of the household's momentary distraction, acting swiftly and decisively, leaving behind only a trail of disturbance and unease. Inspector Harrow, flustered, demanded to know what had been stolen, but Miss Marple held up a hand, signalling patience. Her sharp eyes fell upon a detail that the inspector had overlooked, a single white glove lying crumpled near the fireplace. It was not Thomas's glove, which had already been found in the hedge maze, but a smaller, more delicate piece. Its presence suggested a new player, or perhaps the same perpetrator acting again, testing the household's vigilance and the limits of the investigation. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting this sudden disturbance to the missing note from the tea table. Whoever had removed it was not only aware of its significance, but confident enough to act with impunity. The disappearance of Mary's composure, the subtle shift in Mr. Ellis's attention earlier in the day, and the minute inconsistencies in the housekeeper's statements now took on a more urgent meaning. The perpetrator was orchestrating events in real time, shaping circumstances to conceal the next move. She spoke quietly to the shaken maid, guiding her back to composure while observing carefully. Mary admitted, almost in a whisper, that she had seen Mr. Ellis lingering near the study earlier in the afternoon, an action that, until now, had seemed innocuous. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information alongside other minor observations, noting that Gardner's previously subtle gestures had now escalated into overt action, or at least into a prelude to something more decisive. The evening shadows lengthened, and Miss Marple understood that the manor itself had become a stage for a high-stakes game. The new crime, the intrusion, the overturned table, the stolen or displaced objects, proved that the villain remained not just at large but several steps ahead. This was no longer simply a case of solving Lady Constance's death. It was now a matter of anticipating the perpetrator's next move before further harm could be done. Harrow suggested locking down the household entirely, but Miss Marple's intuition urged a different approach. Confrontation now might provoke another rash action. Instead, she needed to create conditions in which the criminal would act in a predictable manner. She began to consider subtle psychological tactics, tests of attention and temptation, that could draw the perpetrator out without immediate confrontation. Every detail in the manor, the placement of furniture, the lingering scent of tea, even the firelight, could be used to elicit a revealing reaction. By nightfall, the household had settled again, though unease permeated every corner. Miss Marple stood quietly near the drawing-room, her eyes fixed on the tea-table, now devoid of the cryptic note but still central to the web of events. She understood that the second crime, sudden and unexpected, was a deliberate escalation, a message from someone confident in their ability to manipulate both space and human behavior. The challenge was now twofold: to solve the first murder and, simultaneously, to prevent another, all while tracing the careful, shadowed movements of a mind as cunning as it was concealed. The terrible secret of the tea-table was no longer merely a puzzle. It had become a dangerous lever, pulling at the strings of the household. And Miss Marple, with her patient and observant skill, would need to anticipate the next strike before it could claim another victim. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet observation, letting the household resume its routine while she examined every detail as if seeing it for the first time. The servants moved with a practiced ease, voices low, gestures restrained, but even in their composure she detected the invisible currents of tension that ran through the manor. Each small action, each carefully measured response, was a potential signal. The trick, she knew, was to recognize the pattern hidden within what appeared random. She returned once more to the tea-table, now stripped of the note, yet still central to the unfolding mystery. The cup, the saucer, the faint ring of residue, even the slight chip in the handle, all were reminders that this ordinary object had become the stage for extraordinary deeds. Yet it was not the table itself that revealed the key, but a seemingly trivial comment Mary had made the previous evening in passing. The maid had mentioned that Lady Constance always liked things just so when referring to her teacups, a remark that Miss Marple had dismissed at the time as mere observation of habit. Now, in the context of the second intrusion and the vanished note, it struck her with new significance. The phrase illuminated a subtle pattern. The perpetrator had not acted violently in haste, nor had the crimes been random. Each action had been carefully staged to exploit Lady Constance's meticulous habits and the predictable routines of the household. The misplaced glove, the smudged teacup, the shifted vase, and even the missing note were all deliberate provocations, each designed to mislead, to obscure the true sequence of events, and to manipulate the investigators into focusing on distractions rather than the orchestrator themselves. The pattern, once invisible, now became unmistakable. The villain worked through predictability, exploiting order to conceal chaos. Miss Marple's attention then returned to Mr. Ellis. The gardener's subtle gestures and repeated focus on the tea table, his micro-expressions during conversation, and his almost imperceptible attempts to guide attention elsewhere, all were part of the same rhythm. The pattern revealed itself not through overt clues, but through a careful alignment of behavior, object placement, and timing. Miss Marple realized that the intrusions, the disappearance of the note, and the minor disturbances were not isolated incidents, but deliberate beats in a calculated sequence. She also noticed something in the morning's routine that others had overlooked. Mrs. Penrose had prepared Lady Constance's tea in a specific order, teacup first, then saucer, then the note placed beneath. This minor habit, observed for years, had been exploited by the perpetrator to ensure that any message or manipulation would be discovered or concealed in precisely the manner intended. The alignment of these small details created a kind of choreography, a silent code that revealed the criminal's foresight and meticulous planning. Miss Marple began to reconstruct the timeline in her mind. The first murder, the disappearance of the note, the intrusion into the study, even the seemingly trivial placement of objects around the drawing room, all fell into a logical sequence when viewed through the lens of habit and human expectation. The villain had relied on the household's predictability, using minor details as levers to misdirect attention while the real actions remained hidden in plain sight. A gaze drifted back to the tea table, and she noticed the tiniest imperfection, the handle of the cup, chipped not by accident but by repeated handling in a way that left a faint, oily residue. The mark aligned perfectly with the pattern she had begun to see. The perpetrator had handled objects deliberately, leaving just enough trace to provoke curiosity while concealing intent. Everything else, the glove, the scuff marks, the intrusions, was designed to reinforce the illusion of randomness. The pattern, once recognized, revealed the method behind the madness. It was a crime choreographed to exploit the habits and expectations of the household, the servants, and the investigators alike. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The key had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in bold gestures or dramatic clues, but in the ordinary minutiae that only careful observation and understanding of human nature could reveal. Every misstep, every distraction, every hesitation was part of a sequence that now made sense. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was confident in her understanding of the pattern. The next steps were clear. She would need to anticipate the perpetrator's movements, predict the next calculated action, and use the pattern itself as a guide to uncover the true culprit. The chaos of Maplecroft Manor was no longer random. It was a deliberate, structured sequence of manipulation, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, now held the key to unlocking it. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning quietly observing the household, her mind moving through the careful map of patterns she had traced over the past days. The intrusions, the vanished note, the micro-expressions, they were all threads in a tapestry, and now, with the pattern revealed, she could begin to see the design that had driven each action. Yet the motive, the hidden force behind the meticulous chaos, remained elusive. It was not greed, nor simple jealousy, nor even revenge in the conventional sense. This, she sensed, was something far more intimate and unsettling. Her attention, too, reined once again to Mr. Ellis, the gardener, whose subtle behaviours had first signalled the presence of a deeper deception. His eyes, usually so calm and disciplined, now flickered with tension whenever the tea-table was mentioned, and the faintest tightening of his jaw betrayed a long-suppressed anxiety. Miss Marple considered the historical connections she had uncovered, his family ties to previous grievances, the shared past of service under Lady Constance's supervision, the quiet slights and resentments accumulated over decades. But even these did not fully explain the extremes to which the intruder had gone. There was a personal obsession here, an emotional intensity that reached far beyond ordinary human motive. It was in the smallest, seemingly trivial detail that the revelation finally emerged. While examining the scattered items from the evening intrusion, Miss Marple noticed the faint imprint of a hand on the teacup, aligned perfectly with the chipped edge. It was not just the residue or the positioning that spoke to her, but the pressure, the way the fingers had lingered, almost reverently, over the cup. This was not a hand guided by simple practicality, it was a hand expressing care, fixation, even longing. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting this to the subtle glances, the measured gestures, and the carefully orchestrated disturbances. The crime had been personal, intimate, and driven by something far deeper than wealth or petty grievance. She summoned the household again, presenting her observations in the quiet, deliberate tone that disarmed them while keeping her own thoughts carefully shielded. She recounted the minute details, the misplaced glove, the vanished note, the sequence of intrusions, and the faint handprints on objects that had seemed ordinary. "What we see," she said softly, "is a mind meticulously aligning the present with memories of the PA, seeking to impose order on events in a way that satisfies a personal, almost obsessive vision. This is not mere malice or envy, it is something far more consuming." As her words settled over the room, Mr. Ellis's composure cracked ever so slightly. His eyes widened, the faintest tremor passing through his fingers as they rested on the edge of the mantel. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, a silent struggle evident in the lines of his face. Miss Marple had him now, not through accusation, but through the quiet illumination of the truth that he could no longer fully conceal. It became clear Mr. Ellis's motive was intertwined with a lifelong fixation on Lady Constance herself, a blend of admiration, resentment, and a desire to assert influence over her world, even in death. The meticulous staging, the careful manipulation of the household, the symbolic placement of objects, all were expressions of his attempt to control a reality that had once seemed unattainable. The vanished notes, the overturned table, the orchestrated intrusions, each act was part of an intricate choreography designed to assert mastery over her environment, to impose a sense of dominance over someone he had simultaneously revered and envied. Miss Marple, patient and observant, recognized the depth of the psychological drive at work. This was no ordinary crime of opportunity. It was a carefully constructed performance, each detail chosen to satisfy an inner compulsion and to assert control over a world that had offered him only subservience and minor slights for decades. The tea table, so central to Lady Constance's routines, had become a stage for this expression, the focus of obsession and meticulous planning. By mid-afternoon, the truth was undeniable. The crime had never been about wealth, inheritance, or revenge in the ordinary sense. It had been about the assertion of identity, the fulfillment of an obsessive need to control and manipulate, and the satisfaction of a psychological compulsion that had long lain dormant, waiting for the opportunity to manifest. Miss Marple, having traced every gesture, every micro-expression, and every pattern of behavior, now saw clearly why the crime had been executed with such precision and why the perpetrator had been willing to manipulate, deceive, and terrorize an entire household. The hidden motive, once exposed, was chilling in its intensity, revealing a mind driven by fixation rather than mere calculation. And in that moment, standing amid the quiet tension of the drawing-room, Miss Marple knew that the final act of the tragedy, the unveiling of the culprit, was within reach. The terrible secret of the tea table had revealed not only the crime itself, but the dark, consuming psychology that had orchestrated every movement, every deception, and every subtle misdirection. The heart of the mystery, long concealed, had finally been exposed. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon preparing the drawing-room with quiet deliberation, arranging the furniture and objects almost exactly as they had been on the day of Lady Constance's death. Every detail mattered: the tea table, the placement of the cup, the subtle residue along the rim, even the chipped edge that had first drawn her attention. She did not speak of it to the household, but she knew that whoever had orchestrated the previous disturbances would instinctively notice the recreation. It was a stage set not for conversation, but for revelation. She asked the household to gather, suggesting an informal review of daily routines, while subtly observing each movement. Mr. Ellis, as expected, hesitated at the doorway, his eyes flicking to the tea table and lingering longer than decorum warranted. Miss Marple allowed a small, knowing smile to pass unnoticed by no one else. She spoke softly about Lady Constance's habits, casually remarking how some people's actions left traces they could not entirely control, how human nature often betrayed the best-laid plans. Each word was measured, intended not as accusation but as an invisible lure. As the evening light dimmed, she positioned herself where she could observe every gesture, every micro-expression, while remaining composed. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. She began discussing the missing note in neutral tones, describing it not as a piece of evidence, but as a small, ordinary object whose significance lay only in the attention it received. Sometimes, she said, the smallest details carry the heaviest truths, unnoticed until someone pays close enough attention. Ellis shifted in his seat, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes. Miss Marple's gaze followed each motion. She had seen these tells before, in subtle gestures and fleeting expressions that betrayed thoughts the lips would not speak. She waited patiently, letting the tension build naturally, knowing that the right pressure, applied gently and without accusation, could force a revelation. Finally she leaned slightly forward and allowed her words to carry a pointed precision, though wrapped in casual conversation. It is remarkable how predictable human behavior can be. One's obsession with order, with control. Sometimes it becomes evident not in overt acts, but in the manipulation of surroundings, in the careful placement of objects, in the choreography of what is seen and unseen. One cannot help but leave traces of oneself in the world, if only subtly. The effect was immediate. Ellis's hand trembled slightly as it rested near the arm of his chair, his eyes darting almost imperceptibly toward the teacup. Miss Marple waited, allowing the silence to AC. Tea as a mirror to his unease. Then, in a motion so small it might have been missed by anyone less observant, he leaned forward, fingers brushing the edge of the table, as if testing the ground, and spoke in a tight, strained voice. You think I had nothing to do with it?" His question was rhetorical, a desperate effort to maintain control, yet the crack in his composure betrayed him utterly. Miss Marple remained composed, her hands folded in her lap. "I think you have shown me enough," she said quietly, her tone even and deliberate. The movements, the intrusions, the care with which objects were handled, all of it points to one who could not resist, arranging the world according to a personal design. The obsession, the control, and the subtle manipulations, they all lead to you. Ellis's face drained of colour. He attempted a desperate step back, but the placement of the furniture and Miss Marple's calm, unwavering presence blocked any avenue of escape. His breathing became shallow, and the tension that had been tightly controlled over days of subterfuge now unravelled in visible waves. I only wanted to—" His words faltered, the carefully constructed narrative crumbling under the weight of patient observation and precise confrontation. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence, letting the truth settle in the room. Then she continued softly, "It is not merely greed, nor jealousy, nor simple revenge. It is the compulsion to assert control, to impose one's order on the world, even if it requires subterfuge and terror. The evidence, the intrusions, the manipulations, all of these were expressions of that obsession. You could not resist leaving traces, however subtle, and that has allowed us to understand the whole story." The final moments were a careful unravelling, Mr. Ellis realising there was no avenue for escape, and that the subtle cues had been full. Red slumped into his chair. The confession came, hesitant and incomplete at first, then more fully as he recounted the steps he had taken, the motives he had harboured, and the meticulous care with which he had manipulated the household. Every nuance Miss Marple had observed, the vanished note, the micro-expressions, the displaced objects, was accounted for in his admission, confirming the pattern she had traced so patiently. By the time the household exhaled collectively, the tension had shifted from fear to resolution. The terrible secret of the tea table, long obscured by misdirection, vanished into clarity under the patient, careful gaze of Miss Marple. The crime was finally exposed in full, the villain revealed not merely by evidence but by the subtle language of human behaviour, the patterns of obsession and compulsion that no careful observer could overlook. The drawing-room, once a stage for terror and manipulation, now stood silent, the final act completed, and justice quietly achieved. The confession had left the household inattentive, calm, and even Inspector Harrow, visibly relieved, began to relax, convinced that the case had reached its natural conclusion. Mr. Ellis sat quietly, sullen and defeated, while Miss Marple allowed the room to settle, her expression serene yet deeply contemplative. Everything seemed neatly resolved, the pattern recognized, the motive exposed, and the orchestrator of terror unmasked. And yet, a faint whisper of unease brushed at the edges of her mind, a sense that something subtle had been overlooked, a detail too minor for anyone else to notice but crucial to the full truth. As the household slowly resumed its routines, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her gaze lingering over the tea-table. The cup and saucer, the faint residual marks, the perfectly aligned chip, they were silent witnesses to the drama, yet their arrangement now struck her as slightly off. Not the residue, not the placement, but the absence of one tiny, seemingly trivial detail, the sugar tongs. She had noted them earlier, a minor object lying next to the silver tray, brushed aside during the prior intrusions. But now, in light of Ellis's confession and the pattern she had traced, their displacement felt deliberate, not as a clue to his hand, but as a signal placed by someone else entirely. Her mind retraced every interaction of the day, each conversation, each gesture. Mary, the maid, who had seemed so frightened and submissive, suddenly came into sharper focus. Miss Marple remembered the fleeting glance Mary had cast at the mantel earlier, the almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers as she carried the teapot, the momentary hesitation before speaking during Ellis's confession. At the time, these had seemed inconsequential, but now they hinted at a knowledge that extended beyond fear. Someone else, quieter, subtler, had been orchestrating, or at least guiding, the events from the shadows. She approached Mary gently, observing her posture and expression as if reading the room itself. "Mary," she said, her tone soft but precise, "you have been very careful, but even careful hands leave traces. Did you notice how Mr. Ellis handled the tea-table yesterday, and yet you did not intervene?" The maid's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed. Miss Marple waited, letting the silence press, not in accusation, but as a mirror reflecting the truth back to her. Finally, Mary's voice trembled, a whisper almost lost in the stillness. I thought I was helping," she confessed, the words spilling out in a rush. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I knew he would act if left unchecked. I only tried to guide him to prevent worse things." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not in disapproval, but in comprehension. The final twist was now unmistakable. While Ellis had executed the crimes, Mary had manipulated circumstances from the shadows, subtly influencing movements, providing minor distractions, and even altering the evidence in ways that had ensured the chaos unfolded according to her understanding of events. She had been the unseen hand guiding the outcome, shaping the narrative even as the household believed the culprit to be Ellis alone. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the final threads. The vanished note, the carefully displaced glove, the minor disruptions in the drawing-room, they were not only the handiwork of obsession, but also subtly influenced by Mary, whose intimate knowledge of the household allowed her to steer actions without overt interference. Her intentions had not been malevolent in the traditional sense, but the results had magnified Ellis's obsession and terror, creating a chain reaction of fear and manipulation. The revelation transformed the case entirely, the apparent closure was only partial, and the full understanding of the crime required acknowledging the quiet guiding presence behind the storm. Harrow, overhearing the exchange, looked bewildered. "You mean she was—" he stammered. Miss Marple merely nodded. "Intent and influence are not always obvious, Inspector. One can guide events without ever touching the crime itself, and the most effective manipulations are often invisible." By nightfall, the household sat in a contemplative hush. The real tragedy was no longer merely the death of Lady Constance, nor the obsessive actions of Ellis, but the revelation that the threads of human behaviour were far more intricate than they had imagined. Miss Marple, ever patient, had seen through the surface narrative to uncover the true architecture of events, the hidden influences there. Tea had shaped the tragedy. In the quiet glow of the drawing-room, She realized that the terrible secret of the tea table had not only exposed a crime but also revealed the complex, subtle, and sometimes unseen forces that drive human action, a final twist that transformed the understanding of everything that had come before. By the early morning, the tension in Maplecroft Manor had settled into a fragile calm, but Miss Marple remained vigilant. The household had absorbed the dual confessions, Ellis's obsessive actions, and Mary's subtle manipulation. Inspector Harrow, though eager to label the case closed, listened intently as Miss Marple quietly outlined the sequence of events. Her voice was calm, deliberate, each word measured, yet it carried an authority that left no room for doubt. "The truth," she began, "is rarely as simple as it appears. We observed Ellis's actions, traced the disruptions, and noted the pattern in his obsession. Yet had we not considered the influence of another, the subtle hand guiding those movements, we would have believed the story ended there. The missing note, the displaced glove, the seemingly random intrusions, they were not merely the product of his compulsion. They were shaped by Mary, whose intimate knowledge of this household allowed her to influence actions without ever overtly touching the crime itself." Harrow leaned forward, skeptical. "Are you saying she was as culpable as Ellis?" he asked. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Intent is complex. Mary did not commit the murder, nor did she wish death, but she manipulated events in ways that magnified Ellis's obsession and ensured that the chaos unfolded with precise effect. The hand she left invisible behind the scenes was the reason the pattern remained obscured for so long. She's part of the story, yes, but the direct action, the terrible act, was entirely Ellis's doing. She moved slowly around the room, pointing out the small, overlooked details that had revealed the dual layers of culpability. The faint scuff marks near the drawing-room door, the imperceptible drag on the rug toward the library, the slight smudge on the teacup handle, each was a trace of Ellis's compulsion. Yet the positioning of the sugar tongs, the deliberate leaving of certain items untouched, and Mary's careful timing of distractions revealed a secondary influence guiding him, shaping the outcome with subtle precision. "Justice," she said softly, "is not only about punishing action, but understanding the forces that shape it." Harrow, though initially frustrated at the complexity, began to grasp the depth of the observation. The case was no longer a simple matter of crime and punishment. It was an intricate interplay of human behavior, desire, and influence. He turned toward Ellis, who sat sullen, his confession complete, knowing that the law would now deal with him directly. Yet his expression, tight with obsessive pride, hinted at the fragility of the order he had attempted to impose, now irrevocably dismantled by the careful observation of one who saw beyond surface gestures. Miss Marple's attention returned to Mary, who fidgeted quietly in the corner, her pale face betraying relief mingled with lingering apprehension. "You were careful," Miss Marple said, almost kindly, "but even careful hands leave traces. You acted from a desire to control, to prevent further harm, yet in doing so you risked complicity. The lesson here is simple. Human nature, however subtle, can never be fully hidden." Mary nodded, understanding both the compliment and the caution implicit in the words. By mid-afternoon, the household had begun to resume a semblance of normality, though the shadow of recent events lingered like a quiet echo in the corridors. Ellis was taken into custody. The legal machinery now set in motion to deliver punishment for his obsessive crimes. Mary, though not guilty of murder, had been confronted with the moral weight of her manipulations, leaving her with an understanding of her own subtle power and the consequences it could carry. Miss Marple lingered one last time at the tea table, her eyes scanning the familiar objects now calm and still. She spoke softly to no one in particular, as if reflecting aloud, "It is remarkable how often the most important details are overlooked. The cup, the note, the gloves, they seemed trivial to most. Yet in them lay the pattern, the motive, and the proof of hidden influence. To see the full picture requires patience, observation, and an understanding that the smallest gestures often reveal the deepest truths." As she walked toward the door, leaving the household to their tentative peace, she allowed herself a quiet smile. Justice had been served to the direct perpetrator, and the hidden manipulations had been exposed. yet the story retained its unsettling undercurrent, a reminder that human behavior is never fully predictable, and that even in resolution, the echoes of obsession, influence, and subtle manipulation linger, waiting to be discerned by the patient eye of someone who truly sees. The terrible secret of the tea table had finally been laid bare, and for now, Maplecroft Manor could begin to heal under the careful watch of those who understood both the seen and unseen forces at play. As Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp evening air, the sun dipped low behind the rolling hills surrounding Maplecroft Manor, casting long shadows that stretched across the gravel drive. The household lay quiet behind her, its residents gradually settling into a fragile routine now that the immediate danger had passed. Inspector Harrow trailed behind her, still muttering about the complexities of the case. "Where?" Mary lingered in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The resolution felt neat, almost final, but Miss Marple knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. She paused for a moment, letting her gaze drift back toward the drawing-room windows. The tea table, now calm and orderly, had been the silent witness to obsession, manipulation, and subtle influence. Everything had been uncovered, the murder, the obsessive compulsion, the hidden guiding hand, but there remained a faint sense, almost imperceptible, that not every question had been answered. It was a peculiar unease, the sort that only emerged when human behavior was traced to its deepest, most intricate corners. Her mind replayed the events of the past days, the vanished note, the displaced glove, the subtle scuff marks, the micro-expressions and the seemingly minor gestures that had revealed so much. Each clue had fit neatly into the puzzle once the pattern and motive were revealed, yet there lingered a single troubling detail, the faint smudge of ink she had noticed on the edge of the note when it was first discovered. It had been almost invisible, easily dismissed, yet it bore a slight curvature, a delicate flourish in handwriting that did not match Ellis's careful, deliberate script. She had chalked it up to the maid's subtle involvement, but now, with the primary threads resolved, the memory of that flourish tugged at her curiosity. Harrow noticed her pause. "Still thinking about something?" he asked, slightly impatient. Miss Marple shook her head gently, her lips curling in a faint smile. "Only that the human mind is far too clever to ever leave a case entirely closed, Inspector. Sometimes a tiny flourish, a half-forgotten gesture, or the quietest hesitation can hint at things yet to be discovered. It is what makes detective work endlessly fascinating." "Shigla," said once more at the manor, where the lights glimmered through the windows like sentinels of secrets past and yet to come. The evening breeze carried with it the faint scent of tea and the faint, lingering aroma of the flowers that Lady Constance had loved. Miss Marple inhaled deeply, letting the familiar smells settle her thoughts. Even with the confessions and explanations, she sensed that the story of Maplecroft Manor was not entirely complete. Perhaps there were deeper family secrets, old grudges that had not surfaced, or minor manipulations that had gone unnoticed. Such things rarely revealed themselves in full, yet they left traces, small hints, inconspicuous but persistent, waiting for someone with a patient eye to see. As she walked along the gravel path, the crunch beneath her shoes became a metronome for reflection. She considered the many layers of human behavior she had observed, the obsession of Ellis, the guiding influence of Mary, the interplay of fear, curiosity, and misdirection. Each had contributed to the narrative, but each also suggested that no one person could ever fully predict the course of events. Human nature, she thought, is a labyrinth without end, and the detective's work is to navigate it carefully, step by step, noticing what others overlook. Harrow, still a few paces behind, finally asked, "Do you really think it's over?" Miss Marple looked up at the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to prick the twilight. "Over?" she repeated softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "No, Inspector, the truth is rarely so final. A small detail left unnoticed, a gesture misread, or a secret buried too deep can always resurface. That is the nature of human affairs, and the nature of mystery. One solves a case, yes, but the mind that seeks answers must always remain alert, for another question is already waiting, hidden just beneath the surface." She turned her steps away from the manor, the winding drive stretching ahead of her like a path toward new enigmas. The evening air was sharp, carrying a sense of possibility, and even as the case of the tea table had been laid bare, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of curiosity stirring within her. Justice had been served, the pattern revealed, the motives exposed, but the faint ink flourish, the lingering hesitation in a glance, the tiny overlooked movement in a corner of the room, they hinted that another story waited just out of sight, ready to test her patient, observant mind once more. And so, as the manor receded into shadow behind her, Miss Marple walked on, calm, composed, yet keenly alert. The terrible secret of the tea table had been revealed, but the labyrinth of human nature, and the mysteries it concealed, remained endless. The case was closed, but the questions it left behind whispered quietly in the air, ensuring that the mind of a true detective never rested, and that Maplecroft Manor, like all places where secrets linger, would not surrender its final truths without further scrutiny.